The large monster count in Monster Hunter Wilds is currently up to 24, 23 if we don't count Mizutsune, which is a title update coming shortly after launch. Potentially down to 22 if the Rathalos they teased isn't actually a variant and just some kind of weird affliction. However, it's pretty safe to assume that we're at least going to get a few more given that we have no confirmed Elder Dragons unless the Apex Predators end up being Elder Dragons, but I really don't think that's going to be the case. Historically speaking, Monster Hunter games typically don't release with any fewer than 3 Elder Dragons. But before we delve into speculation and predictions, let's go into what we know, starting with the confirmed returning monsters from previous titles. Kongolola, everybody's favorite giant pink Taco Bell devouring monkey. This thing is a series classic, first appearing in Monster Hunter Freedom 2 as the very first monkey we would ever see as a large enemy. Now that does add a little bit of historical significance to this thing as an enemy, but I'm honestly just convinced that Capcom wanted to add a gigantic pink monkey that is going to be taking shits on us in stunning HD graphics. This monkey is not returning by itself, it is also bringing back its icy counterpart Blangonga. Blangonga is at least a little bit more difficult as an enemy, and that makes it a little bit more of an interesting fight, but more importantly, being an ice elemental monster, that means it brings some elemental weapons along with it as well, unlike the next early game monster whose debut was back in the very first Monster Hunter ever, which is Gypceros. There are some things I could say about Gypceros. It is a rather interesting early game enemy, but I honestly think it's a lot better that you just go into the fight totally blind and experience it fresh, because despite its early game status, it actually has some tricks up its sleeves that you might not expect from an early game enemy. Moving on to an equally as ancient enemy, that being Yian Kutku. Now, world players are already familiar with Yian Garuga. You've seen this thing, it's much more dangerous, much more aggressive, and honestly much more interesting than Yian Kutku. Yian Kutku is a very low tier enemy that typically places just after the raptors. That being said, it's a classic enemy to the series. It is one of the most famous early game enemies in the entire franchise, and it's goofy as hell. Fun little fact for you, the world's leading manufacturer in zippers, the company is called YKK. So my entire life pretty much, I've been looking at the zippers on my jeans and stuff, and I always see YKK and think Yian Kutku. Moving on to Rathalos and Rathian. You can't have Pokemon without Pikachu, and you can't have Monster Hunter without Rathalos. You also can't have Rathalos without Rathian. Now for one that I am personally far more excited for, and that is Gravios. Gravios is another OG monster dating back to the very first game, and it was one of the biggest threats back in the day. If you started in Monster Hunter World and ventured into Rise a little bit, you might have seen Basarios, the much easier, smaller, and less threatening version of Gravios. Where Basarios sometimes fails to start a laser beam entirely and just kind of sits there like a dummy, Gravios not only succeeds every time, but sometimes will sweep it across the entire field. Next up, Nerscylla, the progenitor of the Temnoceran family type of monsters in the Monster Hunter series. Even including variants, we've only had 5 total, and one of the 3 original Temnocerans is Lalabarina, who is a new monster to this game that I will cover a little bit later. Nerscylla may not be the most threatening enemy around. It is certainly well before where Rachna Kadaki came in Monster Hunter Rise, and unlike Rachna Kadaki, Nerscylla doesn't have an element. However, it does specialize in status effects, particularly the sleep element. So if you're an individual who prefers a supportive type playstyle where you debilitate the monster or like to sleep bomb, Nerscylla is an enemy that you should probably be excited for. Just like you should be excited for Gore Magala, quite possibly the edgiest edgelord to ever exist in all of Monster Hunter, making some of the edgiest looking weapons, armor, and if the dual blades do not look like his signature claws, I am going to be very upset. Lastly, for returning enemies, we have Mizutsune, confirmed to be the first free title update enemy coming in spring 2025. And that's the 10 returning monsters. Now onto the newcomers, and after them, I'm gonna have some educated guesses that I think are pretty much guaranteed to make it into the final game. Now instead of building up to them, let's just get the biggest ones out of the way. If you somehow don't know yet, Wilds has a huge emphasis on locales and the apex predators that preside over those locales. These apex predators represent the 5 elements of the Monster Hunter series: fire, thunder, ice, water, and dragon. We already have the 4 primary element apex predators confirmed, starting with Nuudra, the black flame, the apex predator that rules the oil well basin. Nuudra is the lone member of the brand new monster family, the cephalopods, essentially a gigantic oil-covered fire-spewing octopus. Now, cephalopods are technically not a new thing to the Monster Hunter series, given that Monster Hunter Generations gave us Nakarkos, a gigantic cuttlefish. However, due to its nature in the game, that was classified as an Elder Dragon. Next is Raidou, apex predator of the Windward Plains. I don't really have anything else to say about it. The footage of it we have is awesome. It looks like a really fun, engaging fight from a really aggressive monster, and I can't wait to see what kind of thunder weapons we can make out of it. Next is Jin Dahad, apex predator of the Ice Shard Cliffs, obviously of the ice element. The apex predator that I am personally most excited for. The webpage for Monster Hunter Wilds only talks about how physically massive Jin Dahad is. From the footage, we can see that is absolutely true. In my opinion, there's almost something supernatural and horror-like about Jin Dahad's appearance that I almost can't quite explain. I feel as if I'm looking at some kind of eldritch horror, not a dragon. It's large, imposing, and footage from the trailers show that it might be quite the cinematic looking fight. And for our last apex predator, we have Uthduna, the apex predator of the Scarlet Forest. Because of the water element this thing wields, I can't help but think of Namielle when I look at it, which I absolutely love because Namielle is my favorite Elder Dragon. When I look at this thing, there are times when its attacks remind me of Zamtrios. There are other times when it reminds me of Almudron. And there are of course some times where it just reminds me of Namielle herself. Sometimes it looks like it's just flopping around. Other times, it actually looks like quite the elegant monster. Then of course we have the mysterious Arkveld. Although is it really that mysterious anymore given that many of us fought it a lot of times in the demo. We know it roams locales, likes to beef with the local apex predators, and is dragon element. Then we have all the monsters that are not apex predators but still need to fill out these regions and make it a living ecosystem. These locales are very important to the game's identity, and we need enemies that really signify what these regions represent. Starting with the Oyawel Basin, we have Rumpapolo, one of the silliest goddamn names I've ever heard in this entire series. Part New Brunswick mosquito, part bird. This thing is weird as shit looking, but it's also cool as hell. A Jarrakan. This is what you get when you fuse a Magnum Hollow and a Rajang together. Equipped with the element of fire and ready to pummel and sear the sins straight from your flesh. Onto the Windward Plains, currently our most fleshed out locale. We got Doshiguma, the goodest but ugliest sin dog, monkey, badger, bear thing. I truly don't know what the hell this thing is trying to be, but I do know that Edward would probably kill it to put it out of its misery. Chatakabra, the newest addition to the small amphibian roster. Nothing much else to say about it. We got Balahara, the Leviathan that seems to plague every single inch of the Windward Plains en masse. And then we got Quematrice, or Cuamatrice. Whatever the hell it is, it's an interesting addition to the brute wyvern family. I really would have thought this flaming porcupine chicken would have been a bird wyvern or fanged beast, but here we are, sharing the same family as all the T-Rexes. Now for the Ice Shard Cliffs. Aside from the apex, the only known monster to this locale is Hirabami, but damn is this thing cool. The first Leviathan enemy that can actually fly, or well, float in this case, close enough, seems to come in groups similar to Doshiguma, so that ought to be interesting. And for the last known locale, we have the Scarlet Forest, also with only one known new monster aside from the apex predator, the oh so fun to say Lalabarina, the third Temnoceran to ever be added to the game or the series, and again, not including the subspecies. This thing is one of the coolest looking enemies they have ever released, and I am so goddamn excited to see what its armor and weapons look like. Right now, it's not known to have any element, and there actually is a decent amount of footage out there, so it's pretty safe to say it's probably elementless. Now there is potentially one last enemy that is not currently known to belong to any locale, and the only potential variant monster known in Wilds so far, that being this blue glowing Rathalos. Now most of its body, if you look closely, still looks like it is kind of red tinted. If I shoot the saturation up, you can clearly see the red here on its knee. You can also see it through the rest of the body, leading me to think that it might just be an afflicted regular Rathalos. That being said, nothing to say that an affliction can't change the element in this game, and I choose to be hopeful that maybe it does. Rathalos and Rathian always oppose each other and have an opposite counterpart. Rathian likes the ground, Rathalos likes the air. Green, red, gold, silver, you get the picture. If this were to be a different element Rathalos, let's say thunder in this case because of the blue glow coursing through its body, Rathian would probably be ice element. These would make these two variants far more distinct than any variant of Rathalos and Rathian we have ever seen before, and that would be pretty goddamn awesome. Speaking of enemies that are always tied together, let's go back to Gore Magala. Gore Magala, as far as global releases goes, is never without its Elder Dragon counterpart, Shigaru Magala. And if you remember what I said earlier about Elder Dragons, right now we don't have a single confirmed Elder Dragon despite every title to date launching with a typical 3 minimum, leading me to believe Shagaru Magala is guaranteed to be one of our 3 starting Elder Dragons. As for the other 2 Elder Dragons, we have 2 very obvious picks just based on how many games they've been in to date, that being Kushala Daora and Kirin. Both of these Elder Dragons have proven to stand the test of time. Whether we like it or not, they end up being in almost every single game. I personally always welcome Kirin with open arms, given that electric weapons can sometimes be a little bit dicey, and for Kushala Daora and all of its many flaws and little annoyances that make me just sick of seeing it, it does the same thing for ice weapons as well, making them rather important enemies in the series. I do also think there's a strong case for a 4th Elder Dragon being introduced, and that is Nergigante. Admittedly, I'm quite worried that Nergigante is going to be forever bound to Monster Hunter World, given its extreme story significance in that storyline. At the same time, that didn't do anything to shackle Gore Magala to Monster Hunter 4 forever, so hopefully Nergigante does make his grand return. It's not like he's been away from the series for a long time at all, but so far we don't have a single recurring Monster Hunter World monster, which if you ask me, doesn't make any goddamn sense. Monster Hunter Wilds is essentially the spiritual successor to Monster Hunter World. Why would you put all these veteran monsters in but not put a single recurring monster from World to help welcome back some of the players that started in Monster Hunter World, which if you didn't know, is probably about 95% of the Western player base. Before World, Monster Hunter in the West was a pretty niche cult following game. I think the simplest answer is just they're saving the World enemies to be a big surprise. It would be absolutely silly for them to not put a single one in, and if anyone makes sense, especially with the absence of Elder Dragons right now, it'd be Nergigante. But I also don't think they would be so foolish as to only add one monster. I think there are a few others that would fit perfectly, and in the end, I would expect to have around at least 2 to 5 World monsters in the game. A couple of the stronger candidates in my opinion, one would be Lygiana, an ice monster, and right now we know that the Ice Shard Cliffs is rather sparse on enemies that make sense to populate that area. As for the Oil Well Basin, I think Odogaron would be a perfect enemy to inhabit this locale. There is also another kind of unofficial archetype of monster that has populated most of the modern Monster Hunter game, that being some kind of invasive monster. Monsters that fill this role are Deviljho, Banbaro, and Betelgeuse. There might be another monster that I'm forgetting, but these are enemies that pretty much always show up in a lot of missions, especially in higher ranks, and cause some kind of trouble for you. Whether that be Deviljho just barging its way into your mission, wielding the monster you're fighting as a weapon against you, or Betelgeuse just carpet bombing you from the sky when you didn't even know it was there. And despite Banbaro's much more simplistic approach to combat and design overall, Banbaro proved to be a very effective monster in this role, achieving meme status and also just one of the coolest goddamn armor sets they've ever created. Banbaro would be my personal pick for the slot, 1 because it's a world newcomer, and 2 because while Ice Shard Cliffs again kind of sparse on enemies, and even though Banbaro can roam to any locale within reason, it definitely feels most at home in an icy terrain. As for another educated guess based on data, we have Diablos. Diablos is the next most frequent monster in the entire series, next to Rathalos and Rathian, who have appeared in every single game. And even though these monsters haven't appeared quite as much as Diablos, they are pretty damn close. We have Nargacuga, Tigrex, Zinogre, and Rajang. Aside from just general popularity, these monsters have amazing equipment in some cases. The importance of having powerful gear that hunters actually want to farm cannot be understated. When you kill an enemy and you get absolutely nothing from it except maybe some decorations, you're probably going to forget it even exists. And when it comes to these 4, they have some of the most iconic gear that is consistent across the series. You know, with some of the classic enemies like Gravios, Kutku, and Gypsaros, it gives me the feeling that they're deliberately trying to throw a bone to fans of the older games. And it's this reasoning that has me thinking and also hoping that they do the same with some of the newcomers near the middle generations. I think prime candidates to choose from these games would be enemies like Duramboros, Celtis and Celtis Queen, Giganox. Forgive the tremendously awful quality of this video. It's been a long time since Giganox has been around, so finding good quality footage, it's just it's not really out there. And then Zamtrios. These are picks that I think of simply because of how long they've been absent from the series, and I think Celtis and Celtis Queen particularly have a really strong case to make it back into Wilds. Wilds is a game that thrives on a living ecosystem. In this game that thrives on creating a living ecosystem with enemies that interact with each other, what better monster to bring back from a sinful hiatus than the monster that practically pioneered monster-to-monster interactions, being Celtis Queen. Celtis Queen is a boss that summons its male counterpart, the Celtis, to to sit on its back and attack the hunter in tandem with its queen. When the queen grows exhausted, it viciously grabs the male off its back, kills it, and feeds on its corpse to gain energy. It is one of the most brutally awesome monsters ever introduced, and it absolutely needs a return. The armor is also amazing. Now, I do believe there's a good chance we even still have new monsters to discover given the locales that only have one newcomer in them. When World came out, I was critical of the small roster compared to Generations and 4 Ultimate. Needless to say, I don't exactly have the same worries for Wilds. The quality of the revealed newcomers, especially with the Apex Predators, seem to be extraordinarily high. And again, we don't have any Elder Dragons yet. If I had to guess, launch will have around 27 to 35 monsters, somewhere in that range. Maybe it's a little bit optimistic, but the roster is already amazing as it is. So honestly, it's not a big deal if I'm wrong about that estimate. And if you would like to talk more about Monster Hunter or potentially look for people to play with, including myself, join my community Discord. Also, maybe follow my Twitch channel. There may not be much on there to look at right now, but I have every intention of streaming Monster Hunter Wilds and probably at least a day or two before the game comes out so I can iron out some streaming related kinks. For as long as I can remember, many people have asked me to just stream anything. They don't care what it is. They don't care if it's Genshin. They don't care if it's MapleStory, a Korean MMO that they know goddamn nothing about. They just wanted me to stream something. So if you're still out there, I appreciate you, and here's your chance.